Hi, and welcome to another video on object-oriented programming in C#, with me, Marinas Toman. Okay, so in this video we're going to look at methods in C#. So a method is just a block of code which runs whenever it's called. You can pass data known as parameters into a method. And methods are used to perform certain actions, and they're also known as functions in some other languages. So why do we need to use methods? So really it's about reusing code. So we can define a piece of code once that does one task usually, and we can use this many times. So a good method will be as short as possible, and it will only do one task. So basically just whatever the name of the method is, that's the task that you're going to do. So a method is defined with the name of a method followed by parentheses. So very similar to Java. C# provides some predefined methods which you're already familiar with, such as the main method. Whenever you create, a brand new project or a console app. But you can also create your own methods to perform certain actions. So as we start to look at building our own classes, our classes are really just they're going to have a lot of methods that are going to perform different functions. So the general syntax is this. So we have our class statement here, and then our method signature. So if we go and look at Microsoft themselves, so what do they say about methods? Pretty much the same. A method is a code block that contains a series of statements. A program causes the statements to be executed by calling the method and specifying any required method arguments. So the arguments are parameters, so the data that we would pass into the method. Every executed instruction is performed in the context of the method, so whatever variables are created within that method, they only their only scope is within that method as well. So they basically live and then die once the method's finished executing. So the main method is the entry point for every C# application, and it's called by the common language runtime, the CLR, when the program is started. So method signatures, that's the first thing that we really need to learn about. So methods are declared in different structures, but we're only going to look at classes. We're only really going to be using them inside classes. So some of the things that you have to have in this is an example down here just of a class motorcycle, and it has some different method signatures. So what we need is an optional access level. So this is public or private, and if you leave it out, the default, so if you just don't use anything, it's going to be private. Okay, so you can see this is the access keyword here, public, and then optional modifiers are abstract or sealed. So you can see you can make things like public, abstract, so you can make an abstract method. The return value or void if there is no return value. So you can see in this example here, there's going to be no return from this method. In this one, for example, it's going to return an integer. So whenever the method's finished, it's basically just going to, you can see in the body here, this is just going to return the number 1. You need the method name. And in C# we always start the method with a capital or an uppercase character. It's just good convention. So each method name has to, usually has to be unique, but we could talk about that later. So any method parameters that are enclosed, so you can see here this one is just empty, it's got no parameters, and then this one is taking an integer called gallons. So whenever this method is called, a number has to be passed into the brackets here, and then you can see we can take as many parameters as we want, or arguments. And that's it. So basically you need your accessor. This is actually optional. But what we definitely need is we need a return. That's mandatory. We need a name, and then we need the parameters are optional as well. We can leave this empty. Okay, so go back over here. So that's what we need to basically create a method. We need method signature with some keywords. So in this example, my method is the name of the method. Static means the method belongs to this class. We could talk about that later, the static keyword. And void, that's just the return type. So in this instance, it's going to return nothing. So in the main method, you would, the one that we're familiar with, you would see that it's always void because it doesn't return anything. Okay, so to call a method, we've been doing this anyway. Whenever we do console.writeLine, console is the class and writeLine is the static method that we can just call, and then we can pass a string in as a parameter, or yourself in writeLine we can pass in multiple parameters. So it's the same here. What in the main method, what our parameter is just a string of arguments, an array, a string array of arguments, sorry. And this main can be called straight from the class, meaning that's what static means, and then it's not waiting on anything to be returned. So it's just going to execute the statements inside and then just finish. So this would be an example of how we could call the method that we've created here, my method. So how we would call that inside main, we just call it by its name. As long as it's in the same class and we've the static keyword, we can just call it straight from the static method main. So the good thing about this is we could call this method multiple times. So instead of writing this line out multiple times, you just call the method, and in this example we've just got one line of code in our method, but this method could have maybe 10 lines of code where it's doing like a job, say getting a file in from the system, taking some data out of the file and then changing it and then saving it back out to the system, something like that. But the good thing is that we can easily reuse this code just by calling the method. So you can see the output down here would be, if we ran this, this would be the output here. So methods are really handy when we have blocks of code that we want to execute, and especially when you want to execute them multiple times over. So code that you're repeatedly executing. So you can see where methods and loops would go together well. So we could have a loop here that could do this in even shorter lines. Okay, so looking at parameters and arguments. So information can be passed to methods, and these are known as parameters. And parameters act as variables inside the method. So whenever we're writing a method, this is called the argument, but whenever we're passing something to it, this is the parameter. Okay, so you can add as many parameters as you want, and you just separate them by a comma. So if we had my method, you could have fname, and then you could have comma, string, sname, for second name. So yeah, we can see here when a parameter is passed a method, it is called an argument. So from the example above, fname is the parameter, and so this is the parameter, and this is the argument then that we're passing in to our method parameter. So using multiple parameters, like I say, it's just, you can put in any type. You can use arrays as well, as we see even in the main method signature here. It's just a string array named args, short for arguments. So in this example, we're taking in a string and an int, and you can see whenever you call it, you need to provide that information. Otherwise, the compiler will say, you need to give me more arguments, or more, yeah, you need to give me more arguments. And remember that if you're doing it, let's say this is the order string and then int, remember when you're calling it you have to pass them in the same order, so the order matters when you're passing in your arguments. Okay, so that's pretty much everything for parameters and arguments, and that's good, because the good thing is that we can pass arguments in, and then we can so we can pass data in basically, and then we can return values as well. So we'll look at that in a wee second. So that's where data can be passed into the method, and then we can return it back out. So there's also a default parameter value that we can assign using the equal sign. So let's say we call a method without an argument, but we need to have, we can't have a null value or an empty argument. So what we can do is we can actually set a default. So in this instance, let's say we wanted a country in for our argument. So we could set this so if the user, let's say in this example, doesn't provide an argument whenever they're calling the method, then the output would be this, because we would set our default. So we would, because let's say if they passed in something that was empty or null, then this line would cause an error. This line wouldn't execute properly, and unless we're checking if this is null or whatever first. So sometimes this is just an easier way that we can give the parameters default values. And like I say, sometimes you can't trust what the user's going to do, or the user of your method. So sometimes this is a good idea just for safety purposes. Okay, so return values, these are very important in methods. So in previous, whenever we've looked at the main method, for example, these use the void keyword. And what this means is just we don't want a return value. So void meaning just do whatever you're going to do, and then you don't need to, the program isn't waiting for a return value. But if you want the method to return a value, you can use primitive types, such as int or double instead of void, and use the return keyword. So let's say in this example here we have, again, we'll just ignore the static keyword, that just means part of the class. So this is our return type, and the method name, and then our parameters. So we're just going to put in the value of x. Let's say when somebody calls this, we will just return x plus 5. Okay, so if you called it here and you pass in 3, it would just output 8. Okay, so the return keyword is one of the things about a method is once the return keyword is met in a method, any of the code after the return keyword will not be executed after that line. So it's basically return, once a method sees a return, it finishes executing. So normally your return statement would be at the very end of your method. Whenever, let's say you're doing some calculation, it would be at the very end. Let's say your method was to get, to square a number. So you pass a number in and multiply it by itself, and then return it after that. Because if you hit return first, then it's just going to stop executing. The compiler usually tells you that anyway, but just so you're aware. Okay, so another example, let's say we take two parameters, and we wanted to add these two numbers. So we could do that, okay, and again, if these were different types, that the order would matter that these go in. You can also store a result in a variable, so like this here. So basically this is what's recommended and really easier to maintain, because if your method is returning a value and you don't set it up like this, then you know, let's say you just call the method on the line by itself, that's going to be, that data is going to be lost. So what we do here is we can set up a variable and we can just save whatever the return value is. And this is usually safer, easier to read, you know, and then we're just printing out what the value is. So this return value is very important. We'll be using, let's say for example, you know, if we wanted to calculate in a date class, we wanted to calculate the difference between one date and another. Let's say we want to return the number of days between, you know, two dates. Then we would return an integer in that instance, and so return's going to be very, very handy for us. And most of the methods that we're going to write are going to have some kind of return statement. Usually the void is only, you know, void methods are only for like if you're printing something out the screen or something like that. But normally our methods are going to be doing some kind of job for us, and then, you know, we pass in data, it's going to be doing something and then returning it. Okay, so it's possible to put in, to send arguments in a key value syntax. So let's say I know that this method is waiting for these variable names, and I want to put them in a different order. So what I can, so let's say in this method we're always going to put out the third child as the youngest. Okay, and then in this order I can say, when I'm calling it, that child 3, I want that to be John, and then child 1 Liam, and child 2 Liam. You know, so basically I can change the order that I can put them in, as long as I know this key. And usually the methods that we're going to be using, you know, if we're using somebody else's methods, these things, this is in the documentation, you know, so these variable names are known. We'll be able to basically look at the method signatures of the methods that we're going to be seeing, so we'll be able to know this information anyway. So this is another way, if you maybe don't know, you know, or there may be some reason that you don't want to put the arguments in the order, you know, that they're set in the method, then you can control that as well. Okay, so finally, the last thing that we're going to talk about is method overloading. So with method overloading, basically what we can do is have multiple methods that have the same name. Okay, so the same name's okay, but the thing that's really going to be different, the return type being different, doesn't really matter either. But what does matter, what does have to be different, is the type of the variable, or the type of the parameter, or the number of parameters as well. So this method, you know, my method takes in an int x. This is different from my method that takes in a float x, or my method that takes in two doubles, because at runtime the compiler's basically going to look at this and say, okay, you want my method, and it looks to see what you know, basically what selection of methods do I have available that are called my method, and then so it looks up that first, and then it gets so what is the parameter that I'm passing in here. So we'll look at an example, it might be easier to explain. So let's say this, you know, plus method int, so it's just adding two integers, and then this plus method double, which is just adding two doubles. So you can see this is a, you know, basically a repeat of code here. And what we could do is, you know, this one would take in integers, and then this one would take in doubles, and that would be okay. So this would all work fine. But like I say, you know, there's a bit of a repetition of code going on here. So instead of defining two methods that basically do the same thing, it's better just to overload one of them. So in this example now, what we could just have is a plus method that has different types of variables. So it has the same number of variables, going in, but it could have different types. And basically at runtime then, so the compiler would look at this method and say, oh right, okay, I've got 2 of these available to me. So if that happened, then it would look at the arguments that you're passing in, and it would look at the type of these arguments, and then based on this information it would know which one of these methods to go for. Okay, so if you in this instance, what it's going to do is it's going to see these are ints and it's going to go for this one, and then in this one it's going to see that these are doubles and it's going to run this method. So overloading is something that occurs, you know, at runtime, so it's something that can be useful for us. You know, sometimes if a method might be named the same, but you know, you want to give the flexibility of passing in, you know, different types of parameters. Okay, so that's basically it for methods. Okay, so that's everything for the video. Thanks for watching.